by the military-industrial complex.
And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
Do we have the confidence to do in the Middle East what our fathers and grandfathers accomplished in Europe and Asia?
The situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating.
What I do oppose is a dumb war.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Boardwalk after 2 weeks off because, well, sometimes life gets in the way and we got other shit to do. So we're happy to be back. We are happy to be joined by one half of the Panjwai Podcast. If you listen to our interview or our guest appearance on the Kogan conversation, this is Luke Coffey, the very, very ridiculously good-looking member of the Panjwai Podcast.
You are correct.
We brought Luke on because today, even though this is an Afghanistan podcast, we're going to talk about Iraq because one can't be discussed without the other. And when we talk about the if you want to call it failures or just the overall 20-year time spent in Afghanistan, at some point we have to address Iraq. So, Luke, thank you for coming on. We asked you to come on because Stu and Kyle hadn't been to Iraq. I'd been to Iraq, and it'd be nice to get another person's perspective to kind of help bounce some of these topics around as we discuss them for the next roughly hour.
Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate you boys having me on, and I appreciate the trust that you've apparently implicitly placed in me to be any kind of voice on what's going on or what has happened in Iraq. But I'm happy to contribute whatever I can, given the limited experience of a private on the ground in Mosul-ish.
That's the only experience that counts, in our opinion. So go ahead and give us a little bit of background on you there, Luke.
Sure. So all in all, I spent about 4.5 years in the infantry. I actually joined the infantry on election day of 2008. And so I deployed to Iraq in October of 2009 for a 12-month deployment. It was a full year. It was mostly it was entirely northern Iraq. And we either were outside of Mosul, within striking distance of Route Tampa and checkpoints, or we were in downtown Mosul. And actually, at the time, we weren't operating in Mosul, but we were at the FOB that's right next to Mosul. So, come back from that, year and a half later, we deployed to Afghanistan, which was obviously a different ball of wax completely. And there were some marked differences that we can dive into here if you like. But all in all, yeah, it was like completely different world to deploy to both of those countries, and I'm glad I got both deployments in because it was interesting to get both sides of the coin. Pun not intended.
Yeah. So you were there for 12 months. You see, October 2009 to 2010. I got there October 5th or 6th, 2010, and I was in Baghdad. So yeah, we just overlapped. Actually, I think the first set of orders I had to deploy said for Operation Iraqi Freedom, then they amended them. It was for Operation New Dawn.
Yes. Yeah, my anecdote is that when I went on leave in August of 2010, so I'd been there about 10 months at that point, I was on leave and it switched over and they had like the news footage of all the guys like crossing back into Kuwait and everybody's like, "You're going to have to go back?" And I'm like, yeah, I've got to go back. So when I left, it was Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2nd Brigade Combat Team, 3rd ID. And when I came back, it was Operation New Dawn, 2nd Advise and Assist Brigade, 3rd ID.
Oh, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that as far as like the two, because we've talked a lot about Afghanistan. You have Enduring Freedom, then you have Freedom Sentinel, and God, what was the other one?
Resolute Support.
Resolute Support. Why was I worked on that. So was it kind of a similar thing in Iraq?
From my experience, granted, like I said, it was limited. My mission didn't change. Like we basically did the same thing we were doing the entire time we were there, which is counter IED operations. So nothing really changed on the small level right away. I mean, there was definitely a big drawdown, like the checkpoint that we occupied, the latter fourth of my deployment, which was miserable. This shitty living conditions in the outskirts of Mosul. We built that thing up just to like break it down and start withdrawing. I think the folks that replaced us were there for like 3 weeks, and then they pulled the plug on that. So it was right before the New Dawn withdrawal essentially started really kicking into high gear.
Yeah. The way I remember it is that when New Dawn started, that was really like it's like what, a 14, 15-month time period where we were just phasing out the U.S. presence. It was basically, a 15-month drawdown, right? And it's like what I did as a intel analyst, a little specialist working in the threat cell, was I was just tracking Sunni insurgent groups, which this is post-surge, and so there was a little bit of stuff in Mosul, right? And that was about it. We had almost no collection going on out in Anbar, which was, it was 99% Sunni. It's where all these groups existed. But it was a lot of what we kind of did in the Kipsi out in Kandahar, with even fewer resources. I would say we had damn near nothing to work with.
The guys that were running around Baghdad, like, was everybody running at night, day operations? Like, what was the operation kind of environment like down there around that time?
I mean, there are almost no operations, right? You had
Really?
Yeah. It was. I remember there was one time where I could actually recall American forces conducting an operation. It was at night, right? It was obviously going to be a night raid on the outskirts of Baghdad. Outside of that, it was typical ground defense area stuff. You had convoys patrolling around the Green Zone and around Al Faw Palace where we were at, and that was really about it, right? It was super dead. It was. I would say it was very similar to kind of what we were doing in Afghanistan. The only difference is in Afghanistan, there was an enemy that was winning. And in Iraq, there wasn't really a formal enemy, because this was more than anything a political struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Well, they were just all waiting and hanging out in Syria, waiting for 2014 to roll around, right?
Fun fact, right?
They're going for a rebranding.
The last thing Specialist Pop did before he left Baghdad, before I left, I was at Al Asad Air Base for my last 3 months there. The last thing I did, they asked me to write a paper, little one-pager, like, what do you think is going to happen? I was like, well, they're all in Syria. The reason why I have done almost no work for the last 3 months is because everybody's in Syria. They'll probably wait till we leave. The Iraqi nation was in the midst of a mild civil war, right? And it's like they're going to take advantage of this shit, and this is after the Arab Spring. And so Syria is a fucking hot mess. Egypt's a hot mess. Gaddafi's dead. Like, the Middle East was just, there was a sea change almost overnight. It's like they're going to take advantage of this and they'll come back. I don't know how successful they'll be, right? But I think they'll try to make a push back into Iraq. And that's exactly what they did, 2.5 years later. Exactly what they did.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like spooky parallels to the Taliban and their original resurgence,
Yeah.
Like, getting there, whoop some ass. Of course, Iraq, it took us longer to whoop ass. We didn't do it in 4 months. We did it in, 8-9 years.
I mean,
well, my math is bad, 6 years, but.
Well, you had to fight a trained army in Iraq, whereas you had to fight a bunch of, not necessarily trained insurgents in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's true.
The Iraq thing, I don't know, do we just start at 2003? Is that how we should go about doing this?
It's hard around really there in 2003, but yeah.
I was 15, but I can read.
Right.
Watching on TV. I mean, I remember seeing the strikes on TV, when that kicked off. I definitely, that's a clear memory in my head when that kicked off.
I remember being 14 and, in the fall of 2002, hearing all this stuff about we're going to go to war with Iraq. It's like, why the fuck are we going to go to war with Iraq? And, I'm 14 years old. I live outside of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I'm just going to go with whatever people tell me because, well, that's the bubble I live in, right? And Saddam Hussein's a terrible person, which that's objectively true. Nobody's going to disagree with that. And then they're talking about he's in cahoots with Al Qaeda. It's like, oh, okay, sure. I mean, Sunni Muslim. That's all I know at 14 years old. He wants weapons of mass destruction. I'm like, okay, well, he probably hates Israel like everybody else in that part of the country or in that part of the world. And I'm not really thinking too much about it. And then what happens is we get really shitty intel from Curveball was the call sign or the code name for the source. He was an Iraqi expat living in Germany, basically stating that Saddam Hussein had unconventional weapons of mass destruction and that he wanted to use them not just on the Kurds, but on America and our allies. And that's what sold Colin Powell into going into Iraq. And I think that's really that was the tipping point, right? Because I feel like Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were just war hungry from the minute those first two planes hit the World Trade Centers on 9/11, right? They just wanted to go to war with fucking everybody. And Colin Powell was seen as the level-headed diplomat of the cabinet. And I think once he was convinced that this is a credible threat, then George Bush made that push. I always felt like there were three theories that people brought up as to why we went to Iraq. And I think the one about about George W. Bush wanted to finish what his father did was the absolute dumbest fucking thing I'd ever heard. And that was a real popular thing. Oh, we went there for this. Why the fuck would we go there for that? That's fucking stupid. Because if you objectively look at Desert Storm, we won pretty handily without having to take out Saddam Hussein, right? Kuwait was safe and everything was good to go, right? So that never held much water with me. And then, you look at
Clooney stole a bunch of his gold.
Yeah.
we went ham on that country.
Right.
Oh man.
You had the the whole thing about weapons of mass destruction, and this has been one that is a little like people debate the semantics, right, on what's a weapon of mass destruction, because it's pretty well documented. Saddam Hussein had mustard gas. Like, he used it on the Kurds. Everybody knows that fucking happened. But is that considered a weapon of mass destruction? I don't think it is. But I know they found fucking barrels of it. My dad has pictures when he went there in 2004, just barrels of fucking mustard gas that they found. It's like, yeah, okay, I can see that. That makes sense. Technically not a weapon of mass destruction.
No, I think we're looking for nuclear weapons. I think that was always
exactly.
what they said they had, and it's like, ooh, well, they have nuclear weapons. But I did just send you that video of Gaddafi talking to the Arab League. He's like, well, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. India has nuclear weapons. Are we going to kill them too? It's like, why do they kill? And it's certainly interesting. But
we might,
yeah. Well, it's the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. Obviously, it's kicked us off into that long war.
Yeah, and I mean that. It's like that. And then there's the terrorism tie, which this is where the intel community of 2003 should have put their foot down and corrected somebody within the Bush administration, or 2002 should have put their foot down and corrected somebody, because Saddam Hussein's an Arab Ba'athist, right? Or he's part of the Arab Ba'ath Party, right? That's Arab socialism. It's a relatively secular government with some ethnic clashes, specifically amongst the Kurds. I mean, there was even a fucking Jewish family that lived in Baghdad for decades, and they just like taxed them a little more and ensured that nobody would bother them. So the idea that Saddam Hussein was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, I mean, I think that's just absolute fear mongering at that point, because it's 2002. It's a year after 9/11. What better way to drum up support for a war than go, oh yeah, he's working with the people that attacked us a year ago. That really drummed up that support from the Americans. And then the coalition of the willing, like fucking Zimbabwe and other countries with no militaries.
Well, I mean, as far as ties go, like, what leader in that part of the world isn't going to have some kind of tie to, some kind of like militant Islamic group? Like at the very least, they're keeping tabs on them. It's probably
like the Kevin Bacon game of Saddam Hussein. How many degrees removed until you find out Qaeda.
How many degrees removed? But I mean, they all have ties, and you could go look at our own Afghan allies, and they all got ties to the Taliban, some way or the other. I mean, their brother knows somebody, or he's in the Taliban. I mean, so in Iraq, I'm sure it's a little bit more removed at that level, but.
Yeah, and we've talked about the loss of focus on Afghanistan when Iraq starts, and everybody thinks of Iraq starting on March 20th, 2003, which is technically when it started, but it starts in like September of 2002. And once it's out there in the atmosphere, in the environment for people to absorb that this is what the administration is thinking of doing, man, we were a year post 9/11. And we were already starting to draw down our emphasis on Iraq, which like the people that say that, Afghanistan. And so the people that say that Iraq was about oil, maybe, fuck it. That makes more sense than all the other fucking ideas they've thrown out, right? Like when you consider that Dick Cheney, when you consider that he's the vice president, he's the former CEO of Halliburton, and it's a big oil company. And then they have KBR, Kellogg Brown.
KBR, man. That's
a fucking
linchpin.
Subsidiary of Halliburton.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was in Baghdad and like I'm walking back to my chew, I'm walking back to the shower, every fucking building had KBR stenciled on the side of it. I'm like, how is this ethical?
Every ounce of food you ever shoveled into your gullet,
Yep.
KBR.
Yep.
Is that like an American DynCorp? You know, because DynCorp was huge in Afghanistan. Is KBR that? But can you describe what KBR did? Because we all know who Halliburton is.
They did
I wasn't
everything.
there for KBR.
Yeah.
KBR, when I
clean
was
the
there,
shitters,
yep,
cook the food, drive
Did
the
my
fuel
laundry.
trucks, laundry, everything was
everything.
KBR.
The one nice thing was I didn't have to do my own laundry. That was really fucking cool, right? But outside of that, because I'm working 14-hour days, 16-hour days, the last thing I want to do is laundry. No, God, KBR was everywhere. I don't remember seeing another contracting company. Everything was KBR, right? So the idea that this was done because somebody wanted to get rich, yeah, that makes sense. That makes more sense than any other fucking reason that was thrown out, at least in my opinion, right? So when we talk about war profiteering, I think like Dick Cheney's the OG for 21st century war profiteering. He probably tripled his net worth.
I mean, it got so bad that Congress had to like step in and like create new rules so that he essentially Dick Cheney couldn't monopolize the contracting business in the Middle East.
Yeah, I had no idea that KBR was a subsidiary of Halliburton. That is interesting because I think like describing it, like if I knew that DynCorp, if the vice president had run DynCorp too, you know what I mean? I'd be like, oh my God, I can't imagine seeing that on the ground, making the connections,
People like to throw out that technically he wasn't the CEO anymore, which he wasn't, right? He did step down, but you tell me he doesn't have a vested interest, shares, just standard influence in the company, right?
I can't remember how much he owned when the invasion kicked off, how much of Halliburton he was a partner in, and how much of KBR and companies like that Cheney was deeply invested in. So I don't read about this shit. So I'm like, my knowledge for all this is at least 10 years old, if not older. Like everything that I read about and everything I immerse myself in is so far removed from modern military history that I probably should just shut up right now and let you guys talk because you seem to be staying up to date on things. But you ever read the book Fiasco by Thomas Ricks?
No, what's that? What is that? I've never heard of it.
He wrote it right after, he's a Wall Street Journal reporter, and he wrote it right after, not right after, he wrote it, I think like right after the surge in Iraq. But it's all about the invasion. That's all it's about is the invasion of Iraq. And he breaks down all these connections that these companies had to different individuals there. He talks about how executives from Halliburton were there within like a week of the invasion. Like as soon as they took the palace in Baghdad, like there was dudes from Halliburton showing up. So like he just breaks all these connections down to where that was the kind of convincing blow for me, because Iraq on a personal level was a complete 180 in terms of like the frameworks that I had inherited from my upbringing and things like that did not hold up to the realities of going to Iraq.
I supported the war in Iraq up until the day I set foot in Iraq.
Yeah.
And then about 6 months after that, 6 months later, I'm like, why the fuck am I here?
Yeah, that's very similar trajectory for me. I was laughing because you're talking about being a 14-year-old and watching on the news. Like that's pretty good wherewithal for a 14-year-old to be like, why are we going? I was just like, fuck yeah, let's go get our kill on. I was ready to bring the hate. But for me, it was a series of minor epiphanies. But the first epiphany I had, I'd been there about 3 months, and I was on a Chinook, and because I had elected to take my leave so late, they gave me like a little 3-day pass thing. So we flew down to Stryker. Is that the name of the big fob in Baghdad?
There's Victory, Liberty, Spiker.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So they flew me down to Spiker, and I just remember I could see out the porthole in the Chinook, and it was just like tan tents and buildings all the way to the horizon. And I was like, why the fuck are we here? Like, this is stupid. Like, this is stupid to be spending this much money to still be here. And that was kind of the beginning of a series of minor epiphanies over the rest of that year, where by the time I got back, like you said, I was done. Like, I was like, this is dumb. Yeah.
Gotta get that. Yeah. As Dave Chappelle would say.
But I think we all had that epiphany though at some point. I think that's one thing that probably defines all of our military service to some extent is having that epiphany. Now, what you believe about it after that, but I think we all were like, something's not right here. Like something's not adding up, and this is really sketchy. And I think we all had to have that epiphany.
I think something that we find amongst the military community or the veteran community is those of us who are not necessarily anti-war, but anti these two wars. When you ask them like, what changed your mind? I feel like 80 to 90% of the time, the answer is, oh, I went and served in that war. I went and fought in that war. That changed my mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good observation. I think I would be interested to see if somebody's done the research on that, some kind of social scientist or something, because it's a complete 180 of perspective.
Yeah,
it speaks to the audacity to some degree, but we won't go down that wormhole because that leads to nothing.
what boggles the mind, right, is that so Iraq ends in 2011 technically, and even though we're still there today, it officially ends December 15, 2011. And within that time frame, we didn't learn anything and incorporate it to Afghanistan. Case in point being, it's like March 20th, the invasion begins. May 1st, George Bush is on the USS Abraham Lincoln with the big ass mission accomplished sign 6 weeks after the invasion. And then the war lasted another 440 weeks.
So the mission accomplished sign was simply bad luck. So it turns out that banner was for that fleet group's mission. Apparently the fleet group had just completed their mission. I read this because I was like, that's bad optics. So it turned out it's just bad luck. It's just being on the wrong ship at the wrong time. So they had this banner made because they were all returning home from whatever their time in the Persian Gulf or whatever. And it was like, oh, mission accomplished for them. So, but Bush appears on that ship and there's this giant banner with no context.
His press people loved that. It seemed like great optics at the time.
They spun it as they spun it as Iraq has been a resounding success. It's time to transition to a new government.
Yeah, but I mean, you could literally say the same thing within the first few months of Afghanistan. You could be like, "Hell yeah, man! The enemy's beaten, and we got this, baby!" Man, yeah.
I mean, they might have stayed beaten if it wasn't for shifting our attentions elsewhere.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, you technically beat your conventional enemy. The only thing is that conventional enemy just switched to being a non-conventional enemy. Like it was still the same dudes. Like it was still all the Ba'athist gen. I mean, fuck, ISIS was mostly made up of Ba'athist generals from the old days. Like
so one of the groups was JRTM. We just called them Naqshbandi, right? Because Jaish al-Rajal al-Tariq al-Naqshbandi. It's a technically they're a Sunni Islamic extremist group, but really it was just like the old Ba'athist party gone guerrilla. They were led by Ieds al-Duri, like the token ginger of Iraq, who was like Saddam Hussein's minister of defense. I think he was like the ace of clubs in the deck of cards. You remember that shit, Luke?
Oh yeah, I never got my hands on any.
I have like 2 or 3 packs. I have a deck somewhere.
Do you have a deck? Wow, that's awesome. I remember seeing that on the news. They could and of course, when I was a kid at the time, I was like, oh, we got a deck of cards with these bad people on them we're going to kill. Like, that's cool, man. Yeah, that's hilarious. I just have a weird memory that when you brought that.
I have a deck somewhere. I mean, luckily, I'm in my new house and I'm unpacking. So if I find them, I will definitely upload some images of my deck O cards. And I'm pretty sure my dad went to Iraq in like 2004 to Fallujah, so I'm almost 100% sure he's got a deck of cards. I get a hold of him.
I would think so.
So we go in, we push out the conventional Iraqi army, and instead of extending an olive branch and reincorporating them into this new government, we don't, right? It's oh no, you were loyalist to Saddam and he's terrible, and so they all go fucking underground. And this is when we start to see this increase in, there was like one quasi-insurgent group prior to that, and there was like an offshoot that would eventually become AQI, but even then it was largely dormant up until we showed up. So I think one of the biggest backfires from going to Iraq is that really kicked off the global presence of Al-Qaeda. Because prior to that, they were just in the fucking mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? We go to Iraq, and now all this that they've been preaching about America is trying to go in and conquer Islamic lands. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It looks fucking true. Mm-hmm. That was enough. So now we've got Al-Qaeda.
And imagine what the floodgates of funding and money that opened for them.
Yep, exactly. Right. And so like from there, we were just fucked. You got AQI. You had like 6 or 7 other groups that would eventually absorb into AQI, become the Islamic State of Iraq. You have Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Al Shabaab, pledges loyalty to Al Qaeda until ISIS rolls around. North Africa, there's like 3 or 4 different Al Qaeda cells now. The Southeast Asia's got 3 or 4 Al Qaeda cells now. And a lot of that stems from not what we did in Afghanistan, but what we did going into Iraq. That appearance of imperialism was all it took to take people who were maybe not even necessarily moderate. We're probably moderate Muslims and just want to be left alone. Now to look at it and go, oh, well, the white Christians want, because they still call us, crusaders and stuff like that. When you look at some of these press releases, you're like, oh, they're trying to come and take our lands and kill us because we think differently and shit like that. And that has led to the issues we have now, where we have, shoe bombers and underwear bombers and, Al-Shabaab targeting cafes in Uganda during the World Cup, right? Not to say that wouldn't happen without us, but I think our involvement in Iraq really exacerbated that situation.
If you ever write a book, you got your title, Appearance of Imperialism.
The appearance.
That's a good line.
And it's like you guys say, no, we're not crusaders. We're not here to take your land. We're here to kill you for money.
Yeah.
If I wish we had ideals, we're just here for money. Right?
At least imperialism has benefits. Like the fuck do we we get for all the wars that we fight in the Middle East are for influence. Ugh.
Yep,
and money for the rich.
Yeah, it's influence
fight,
and
like
land, money for some people. But yeah, it's like as far as like a country, like we're not fucking importing anything from Iraq. From that standpoint, the oil argument doesn't really stand up, because we didn't like go over there and literally fucking pump oil and bring it back to the U.S. But at the same time, that
0 drops.
Yeah. It would be kind of nice to get to bring home some shit. At least imperialism has its benefits. I'm not advocating for it. I'm just saying our shit's a little worse than imperialism.
It's almost like it would have been hypothetical. It was almost like it would have been better for the courses of American history if Dick would have walked out on stage and be like, we're just gonna take their shit and leave, and then like, okay, sure. Like there's probably terrorists there, and 6 months later we'll be gone.
But you see, dude, that's a better plan. Go ahead, Stu.
Oh, that's my favorite idea for American responsiveness. Like we should be 100% responsive. I'm guessing the CIA can't be 100% wrong all the time. Like I'm guessing they might have foiled some plots that would have taken place on U.S. soil. But I don't know, if I'm fucking king of America tomorrow, my idea is, we essentially stay 100% responsive, and you go in scorched earth and then you just fucking leave. And that basically handles all of the imperialistic problems and the building up of the ideologies against us, because hey, they got attacked and they just kind of rolled in and killed a bunch of people and left. I mean, makes sense to me. I don't want them to come back. Fuck.
Had Dick Cheney just walked up on stage, said, we're going to take your shit, and just fucking done that and left after 6 months, that's a better plan than what we did, because the biggest parallel between Iraq and Afghanistan is that we show up, we are extremely successful very quick, and then it's like, well, now what the fuck do we do now? Well, I guess we'll put a government up, we'll prop one up, and we do that in Iraq, and we go from having Saddam Hussein, who is a Ba'athist, right? He's a Sunni Muslim, but it's a relatively secular government, right? We go from that to Iraq is a 60% Shia country, so now it has been a Shia-ran country for the last, I think, 17 years, and that all that did was enhance the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, right? Because Iraq sits between them. The western part of Iraq is Sunni. The eastern part is Shia. The eastern part obviously touching Iran. The western part touching parts of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. And all we did was create a civil war by going in and doing that. Because when the Shia came into power, all they did or what they ended up doing, was the exact same thing Saddam Hussein did, but now they were targeting Sunnis instead of Kurds, right? So we had like a 3-year civil war. Then there was another civil war after that, from 2013 to 2017, around the time that ISIS rolls back in. Like, we just further destabilized a country. And when reporters go back to Iraq and they talk to uh, locals, be they in Baghdad or Mosul, they don't talk to them in Basra, at least not for the purpose of this conversation, right? But they ask them, hey, is Iraq better now, or was it better under Saddam Hussein? And it's like 50-50, right? That people think it was better under Saddam Hussein. And I hold the very controversial opinion that, it's the whole devil mentality. He wasn't going to attack the United States. He never had a plan to attack the United States, because in 1991, we fucking steamrolled him. And Iraq at the time in 1991 was the best trained, most professional army in the Middle East and North Africa. And so that was a statement to that entire part of the globe of what we can do when we put our minds to it and we put our assets and resources to it, right? So he was never a threat to the U.S. And all we did was destabilize the country that, yeah, they're not a friend of ours, but they can help keep the peace by having a pretty shitty guy in power, right? He's not in charge of my country. So, like, to sound a little non-interventionist, if you will, I don't fucking care what he does to his people.
Yeah.
Right. But he's keeping the peace. And
well, I mean, that part of the country,
in that part of the world, you need that.
Yeah. Sorry. That kind of carries back to what I was saying in our conversation on the Kogan Conversation podcast.
Yeah.
It's like, we like America, sees issues in other countries and people decide that something needs to be done about it without thinking about the consequences. And hopefully, an entire, 2 or 3 generations have been able to see, the dangers of going in and trying to intervene in these areas where they might be better off without us intervening at all, even though there's a terrible guy in power. The terrible guys in power are, I mean, half the damn countries in the world are run by, horrific, evil men that, got there by killing their way to the top. But I mean, shit, Russia's run by a freaking mobster at this point. But, what benefit would there be of us going in and fighting a bloody war, losing lives to, take out Putin or, any other leader? Like, things can be bad somewhere else and America will still be okay. And I think that's something to take away from the past 20 years of conflict.
I mean, in a way, the whole premise of invading Iraq was just like a bad hangover cure for Vietnam and the 80s and everything else. It was like the dying throes of that exceptionalism, of we can go in and we can fix it because we're America. And I think it was the straw that broke the camel's back on learning that lesson, because I think not only are our government, maybe it's a little more hesitant to do it. At least, like, God, I hope they are. But the American people are sick of it too, And unlike previous conflicts that were in the news for 2 weeks or were a flash in the pan comparatively to Afghanistan and Iraq, this is something that's, like you said, it's in multi-generational now. So the lessons learned are going to take 2 more generations to pick apart and figure out,
I have zero faith that the elected leaders in America have learned a fucking thing from the last 2 wars.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you there.
I base that entirely on, like, when the whole evacuation was going on in Kabul, and you have people like Tom Cotton, right? So to answer Alan's question from the Kogan Conversation about veterans in Congress, Tom Cotton is somebody that is in the Senate, and he thinks that, just keeping 2,500 people in Afghanistan would have, maintained stability in perpetuity, right? And it wasn't going to fucking happen, right? So I have no faith or confidence that the people in charge have learned anything from these 2 conflicts.
I mean, hell, that's what the last 6 years in Afghanistan looked like. All it was for the politicians was, how many troops can we bring home to make it look like we're the guy that's bringing your kids home, while at the same time kind of maintaining some form of control over there. Like, I think that's why the troops kept deteriorating as, time time went on to the point where they were essentially combat ineffective, and we couldn't, reach out to the areas that the Taliban were actually operating. I mean, my God, how long did it take to build a fucking road from Kandahar to Uruzgan? I mean, months, and we
Weeks.
couldn't build up any area of control within Uruzgan when we moved up there. They fought for after we left. I kept track of what was going on in Uruzgan. Like, dude, 3 fucking years later, they still hadn't cleared like more than like a few hundred meters in any direction. It was insane.
Well,
but something that I wanted to mention about the like nation building issue is that fucking our successes in Germany and Japan post World War II really fucked up our ideas on nation building for like the next century. Like, that totally screwed up our like understanding of what we're able to do in different areas, because we like soundly, I think the biggest issue is like we soundly defeated those countries, like not just their governments. We didn't just go in and topple their government and replace them. We defeated every single person in that country, like down to their soul. We did it with force of arms in Germany, and we did it with 2 bombs in Japan. And like, the only real way that you're going to get like a nation to change their ideals and rebuild according to like essentially the way you want them to rebuild is to defeat like everybody,
Level
like destroy their spirit essentially, which is what we did in those 2 countries.
But the thing that those 2 countries have that Afghanistan and Iraq don't have is a homogenous society.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have any cultural unity at all. No shared history. No, like Japan, for example, we got millennia of kind of a shared history to an extent. But, just kind of bring it back to the elected official thing. Like, definitely, Zach, I think you're definitely right there, and I'm inclined to agree. But perhaps even more dangerously is it's caused one half of our body elect to balk up at the idea of doing anything because they're scared about pissing off their constituents and their base, and the other half get their little peckers hard at the idea of dropping bombs. So they're on a hair trigger because they think that it appeals to the chest thumping, part timer who's into CrossFit and has a 3% sticker on the back of his truck. So
that's a scary point. Yeah,
yeah.
You're right.
Are 3% stickers on trucks the new tap out T-shirts? So.
Punisher stickers. You get 1 for every domestic violence charge you get.
Oh yeah, definitely. Oh man,
it's like, I think one of the lasting legacies from Iraq, and Stu brought this up when we were talking about like months ago, the idea of doing this episode. What Stu brought up, and Luke, this is for you because you had to deal with it more than us. The big takeaway from Iraq that went back to Afghanistan was the IED, right? Like that wasn't a real common thing in Afghanistan prior to Iraq. And then Iraq happens and Al-Qaeda's got their IED experts out there and they're training, and that technology comes back to Afghanistan. And now you've got a podcast, or you've got a couple friends on there who, had unfortunate interactions with that. And that is in large part because of, losing that focus on Afghanistan and turning to what was ultimately a non-issue in Iraq. And, listening to your guys' episodes and like, fuck, I'm so happy I wasn't infantry because this sounds just fucking miserable because it's hot in Kandahar, right? Like it's fucking hot. I'm like, God, they're hucking, they're just humping with all this fucking gear. Like, well, at least he's got the goose if something happens. That'll be fun to shoot. But, I would fucking hate to be lead up there with a goddamn minesweeper trying to, take a couple steps. It's like, fuck. And all we had to do was maybe not go to Iraq, and this might not be as big of an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's a remarkable bridge. Iran conveniently sandwiched between those 2 countries. How convenient that the IED technology worked its way over from Iraq to Afghanistan.
Crazy.
But I mean, IEDs in Afghanistan, other than the occasional monster in the mountains that took out like a Humvee pre-2000, basically pre-Marines moving into Helmand, it was more or less a minor thing or unheard of, or not a primary tactic that was used by the Taliban. So, right around the time Iraq's drawn down, all these dudes start just shuttling across the border, and they're bringing their expertise, and they adapt it, and you're just like they did in Iraq. They're like, okay, we can't drive trucks with 1,000 pounds of explosives in it down the road anymore, so we're going to put 1,000 IEDs in the ground that that are 5 pounds apiece, and by scattering them everywhere, they completely changed the tactics. So just like the IED, yeah, it's almost like the moniker for these wars. It's like those are the IED wars in a way. But yeah, it was in Iraq. My personal experience, that was our entire purpose the entire time I was there as an infantry platoon, was counter IED operations. So we were either the chase trucks for route clearance, which was boring as fuck, man. You're talking going down the road at like 4 miles an hour at night under nods, like 300 meters or 500 meters behind route clearance, because I guess you're supposed to go chase down the guys who potentially blow this IED. Yeah, that tactic worked. Or we would go sit out in the desert and watch Route Tampa from about half a click away under nods, i.e. sleeping. I think I saw a UFO actually one night in Iraq. That's a different story.
Oh wow, yeah.
Ripping about just how bad
Rippets,
Tampa and Route Irish War, right? Like that was the big thing. Like because we deployed to Iraq. I'm 22 years old. I got a bunch of people who've been in the Army for like 15 years, and they've gone to Iraq 2 or 3 times. Like, oh, fuck, MSR Tampa. It's just like, it's off IED Alley. Route Irish is fucking terrible. And I get there as like New Dawn, and it's just like, there's a fucking green beans on the corner. It's like, oh, yeah. Okay, I guess I'll go over there and I'll get some coffee.
Yeah. And, and honestly, like my Iraq deployment, I saw zero combat. I didn't even get a CIB in Iraq. Which, and we actually knew that going in. Like we had been told, like you're probably not going to get your CIBs. So the only threat that we had going on was IEDs, and even that was super minimal. I never so much as heard one explode. That wasn't a controlled death. Now, unfortunately, sadly, we did lose 2 guys in our company to an IED, Lieutenant Robert Collins and Specialist Anthony Blunt. And then there was a VBID that hit one of our Cav scouts, but they were fine. Like everybody in the truck was fine. Just got their noodles rocked a little bit. But, that was pretty minimal. For 12 months to have 2 IEDs across a battalion. I think somebody hit a tire popper, like a small one that blew their tire off. But the rest of we were able to either stop or route clearance found. So it was just like that was the only mission at the time for combat arms, because there was no active combat operations. We weren't clearing city blocks and things like that. So the ability to like bring the full force of whatever infantry, combat engineer, Cav scout, whatever's in that area down on that one particular mission set actually pretty much eradicated the IED problem.
So we had a relatively eventless deployment as well. There was Christmas, right? So on Christmas, the extremist Islamic groups like to chuck rockets at us non-Islamic practitioners. And so in Christmas night 2010, we got 13 rockets. And I was trying to Skype my wife in the middle of all of that. And in Iraq, the internet doesn't cut out like it did in Kandahar, right? You get a fucking an IDF attack, and you get the British lady on the comm saying rocket attack, and then all the internet goes down. Well, they didn't go down in Baghdad, right? So I'm talking to my wife, and she can hear the IDF siren, and she hears the first 2 rounds hit the ground. Like, hey, I'll call you back, and I slammed shut my fucking laptop. Like they've never killed anybody. On the off chance they're going to kill me, I don't want her to fucking watch it, right? So I turn it off. We get like 7 rounds in, and like 15 minutes later we get the all clear. So I hop back on Skype real quick, and like it's Christmas night in Baghdad, so it's Christmas morning in Idaho, and so I call her back. I'm like, hey, I go to tell her I'm fine. She goes, was that a rocket attack? And before I get an answer, the next fucking volley comes in. I'm like, hell, I'll just call you at work, and it just fucking slammed my laptop shut again. And I go to work, and it takes me like an hour, right, to get around to being able to get a hold of her. And I felt so fucking bad for her, because my wife has like no like she's a civilian. She has no experience with the military. Like we had been dating for like 4 months. I did that thing where I got a girlfriend right before I deployed. But 11 years later, we're still together. So
Yeah, that worked out. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
And
man.
so
I mean,
she's. Oh,
go ahead. I just feel like that's something that people maybe aren't quite as aware of. Like, because at the tail end of our involvement there, it was so dead. I mean, it was basically stabilized. You know, like, I mean, I think if we would have stayed, there would have been problems, continual problems. But you know, it was more or less a peaceful place because of how much of a presence we had there.
There was the one night where the CRAM actually worked, and it split a 107 in half, right? Which that's great and all, but one half of that 107 landed right above my office. Now, granted, I'm literally working in Saddam Hussein's palace. Like, what used to be his theater room is my fucking office, which is really cool, right? Like, every Sunday morning, I'd go upstairs on top of the palace and hit golf balls and try to hit the engineering building across from the lake at a Outfall Palace, right? Like, that was my deployment. Well, so it fucking lands up there, and we get told that we need to evacuate the palace so that they can detonate the UXO, the unexploded ordnance. I'm like, why do we need to leave? Like, well, they need to detonate the UXO. I'm like, this palace took 2 fucking JDAMs. I can't just keep working while they just do their thing real quick above me. I'm not going to feel it. I'm not going to hear it. No, like, that was the closest I came to having any actual warlike anything, especially being an intel analyst, right? Like, I'm a fucking fob, but I'm never going to leave the fucking wire. I don't have to do my job. Right. It was pretty easy going.
Yeah. And that was, it's kind of funny to talk about jobs like that. That was the thing that burned us up so much in Iraq, because the op tempo for us was, especially during Operation Iraqi Freedom, when we switched to New Dawn, we were doing a lot of just base. We're sitting on the checkpoint. We did a couple patrols, but during the Iraqi Freedom, during that summer, the op tempo was insane. Like, we were going out every night because of the nature of the mission. We'd be gone for 14, 16 hours, sometimes 24 hours. And so it was a chip on our shoulder to be like out there doing infantry shit, but not getting into anything, like not actually getting to have that experience. Joke's on me. Got to go to Panjwai. And I got it tenfold there.
You hung out too long. You got it eventually.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I mean, I consider myself fortunate now that I've got them all, digits and limbs, and there's no holes in me, so I'm thankful for it. But the mission set and just like the atmosphere and everything was just so low key. I mean, I think I got pulled for a bullshit gate guard duty in Mosul. So between the airfield and the FOB, there was like a little, it's just tactically sound. There was like basically they hourglass into one choke point that connects to like downtown Mosul.
Yep. Yeah, I know that.
And so I got put on that little choke point for a 2-week guard duty rotation. And I'm sitting there one morning, like, bullshitting with the random dude from Uganda who's like the African contractor. Akali Marundi, I think was his name.
I love those dudes.
Oh yeah, they were so cool, man. He was trying to get me to come to Uganda and marry his daughter, and like he was ready to adopt me into his household. He was trying to get me to come and work for their like anti-poaching people, And at the time, I was like, that sounds pretty badass. And I'm sitting
might be
there,
a little more fulfilling than what we fucking did.
Yeah, I think it probably would have been. But I'm sitting there, and this speaks to the inactivity. Is I hear this like probably about 300 meters outside the gate. And I'm like, what was that? It was a fucking rocket, but I had no frame of reference. I didn't even know. This is 6 or 7 months into the deployment, so it was just a completely different world, man. I don't know. Story doesn't go anywhere, but
for how violent it was at the beginning. I mean, how violent Fallujah was, and just how horrible early Iraq and surge Iraq was. And it's like that is wild that you're sitting there at the tail end of it, and it's just so damn.
Oh, the deployment before my Iraq deployment, which was they got back in the fall of 2008. So a year later they were deploying, and it was they were in Sadr City in 2007, and they were part of like the big battle and building the walls and shit like that. They got hoarded out to 4th ID or somebody for that. So the deployment before that, like, those guys were, getting into shit and seeing some crazy wild stuff. And a year later they go back, and it's all's quiet on the, northern front, at least from Mosul.
Yeah. Speaking of Sadr City, one of the we did get a little uptick like towards the end of our time, and I think it had more to do with the Arab Spring, right? No, I think it had to do with them with the Shia groups taking advantage of the Arab Spring. We did have 2 casualties when I was there, and they were in my battalion. They weren't in my company. I never met them, but they were in a Humvee outside the wire, and I think they were heading to the green zone, or they were doing just a base patrol, right? And an EFP got them in the middle of the vehicle. And so we talk a lot about IEDs. EFPs were exponentially worse, and that's electronically or
explosively formed projectile.
Explosively formed projectile.
Yeah,
and it was a piece of brass, or was it copper?
Copper.
It was
copper.
It's an inverted copper cone in some kind of tube with an explosive behind it. And so what would happen is you have the explosive here in the inverted copper cone. When the explosive goes off, the cone gets pushed and inverted and turned into this essentially like molten copper projectile, and that'll go through pretty much anything and
anything.
It just shredded.
That's where we got the
vehicles.
MRAP from.
Yeah.
And
so when it would hit vehicles, it would push, like, a cut hole through the center and then push through the other side. And I mean, it would fuck people up from the overpressure and kill people. And I mean, if it hits you, you're obviously just fucking nothing.
They drove over an EFP and it split the vehicle in half. The driver and the commander and his driver were both killed. And this was like 5 feet outside the wall of Camp Victory.
Wow. And that's the thing. That's another one of those minor epiphanies for me. So when Blunt and Collins got killed, this would have been in April, so it was about almost halfway through. It was just like, what the fuck, like these nothing's going on, and guys are still getting killed because we're withdrawing, tactical withdrawal, trying to play the political game of pulling out 1,000 soldiers at a time instead of just leaving. Of course, we saw what happened when we left overnight in Afghanistan, but Iraq, it would have been the same situation, but not as extravagant. I don't think. It would have been like a postponed power vacuum.
Yeah, it's hard to do a full on comparison of the two, because even when we left Iraq, like the war ends technically on December 15th, 2011, but we were still there, and we are still there now, right? It's not like we ever had a full-on withdrawal, and that's because we were dealing with a government body, not the Taliban.
Yeah.
But I bring that AFP story up because, the Shia are running the country now. The Shia have the ear of Iran, or Iran has the ear of the Shia, however you want to word it, right? These same people who were, launching who were emplacing EFPs targeting us, we ended up working alongside them in the fight against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, right? Like this. It doesn't take somebody with a fucking master's degree from like the JFK School of Public Policy to realize that this is a terrible fucking predicament to be in, and we put ourselves in it, and we objectively gained nothing out of our time in Iraq except more lost lives.
Yeah,
and a larger extremist Islamic ideology base to potentially have to fight against one day, because you're going to have politicians until the day that there are no more Islamic extremists, which will never happen. There will always be extremists of every shape, size, color, creed, and ideology. They're going to use that, to push certain policy ideas, and it won't be their kids that have to pay the price for those policy ideas.
Do you guys see anything that we could have done to prevent ISIL forming? Like, at least on
my 2 cents is, as soon as their little Peckerwoods came out of the woodwork, bomb the fucking shit out of them. But we didn't do that because of certain, understandable political means. I mean, who wants to start another war 2 years after the other one just ended, and Afghanistan's in full swing?
Yeah. This is why I have been not necessarily a critic of the surge, but why I haven't been so quick to say that the surge worked, right? Because everybody says, "Oh, the surge worked. We stopped getting attacked." Yeah, but we didn't defeat the enemy. They just fucking left.
They just hung,
right? It's the Viet Cong sliding into Cambodia real quick so they can't be touched, or sliding into Laos. It's the same concept, right? They just weren't there anymore. Like, we'll just wait them out. They're going to leave eventually, and then we'll come back in, like the Taliban did when Barack Obama said, well, we're going to do a surge, and then a year or two later we're going to pull out. And they said, okay, well, we like fighting during that time. It didn't decrease or didn't stop altogether, but it did decrease in certain parts of the country, right? Because some people were just like, oh, we'll just wait them out. Like,
Yeah,
we got the time.
that's exactly what happened.
I think, like, if you want to eradicate the Islamic State of Iraq so that ISIL never forms, you have to, like Luke said, you got to go scorched earth, right? And if you go scorched earth, you're going to deal with millions of civilian casualties, and at the end of the day, nobody looks good. So, not to be that guy, but I think the answer is to never go to Iraq in the first place. I don't think the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant exist without the Iraq War.
Yeah,
I really don't.
I mean, absolutely, man. I mean, it was like breeding ground for those folks, even the way they fight.
Could you have reconciled with the Ba'athist? Like, we talked about that earlier, and shout out to the History of the Crusades podcast and the Reconquista podcast. They're fantastic if you like history. But she's great, the lady that does that. But in the one, she's talking about Al-Andalus and Muslim Spain at the time, and always the most success anybody ever had ruling that was to rather than just slaughter the people that they disagreed with, like the really good leaders would be like, okay, no, you're in my council now. Like I know you just tried to kill me, but like, how about we have a seat for you here at the government, and that way you keep an eye on them, like what they're doing, but you also give them something to work toward, because if you don't, they're just going to revolt against you. So
I mean, really, in the course of history, that's like been every successful, massive dynasty or empire. That's more or less what they've done. Like Genghis Khan, the Tang dynasty in China, like, they brought people into the fold. But America, we can't do that.
Senator Biden, maybe Senator Biden had an idea when he was talking about like basically balkanization of Iraq and creating 3 states, right? The Kurdish state, the Shia state, and the Sunni state. Like, in hindsight, maybe it's something more like not necessarily an Islamic republic, because they're not really they like, it was a secular government, right? But maybe it's like just the Republic of Iraq, where you've got 3 kind of semi-autonomous regions. Maybe that does
fix all those fucking lines that they drew 200 years ago to destabilize the Middle East. Yeah, that might help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you ever have the pleasure of working with any Kurds, Zach?
I did not. I was really upset. So, being the Sunni extremist organization threat analyst, most of my work centered around Mosul, right? Because that's where all the action really was. So I had like 2 projects I had to work on as the analyst. I had like this daily. At first, we called it an assassination tracker because it was that prevalent, and then they thought that sounded a bit too crude, so it became like the targeted attacks tracker, right? And I got into a pissing contest with a warrant officer from Third ID. I think it was Third ID. Because the criteria to be a targeted attack was, one, they had to work for the government. Like, what I was doing was I was tracking who within the Iraqi government was being assassinated, where, the time of day, the day of the week, the neighborhood, time of year, like just trend analysis, right? That's my job as an analyst. And so I'm building it, and I have like 15% more assassinations every week than Third ID has. And like, well, why do you have more? I'm like, well, because this person was clearly targeted for being a government employee. Like, well, she's just an administrative assistant. So do you think they happen to just kill an administrative assistant? Or do you think they know that she works for the fucking government and she's not that important and they can offer and nobody will care?
Yeah.
Right. I had that conversation, and I actually, that went over my head. It went over my chief's head, over my colonel's head, to General Austin's head. General Austin was the commander of U.S. Forces Iraq when I was there, and he sided with me. Pretty happy about that. It was just in an email where I said, nope, it counts, right? Basically what it said. So that was pretty cool. So that was one project I did. And then the other project I did was I was tracking foreign fighter facilitation, because there was a clear, obvious trend in Iraq. Whenever a foreign fighter entered the country, that was a suicide bomber. right? And they always crossed in from up there on the Syria, Nineveh border, going into Mosul, then back down, or then down into Baghdad, right? So those are the two things I did. So I got really familiar with Mosul. I wrote a couple white papers about Islamic jurisprudence up there and about the state of Islamic extremism in northern Iraq and stuff like that. And I tried to get up to Mosul. There was the option or the opportunity to go. And I was like, yeah, I would love to fucking go to Mosul for like, I think it's like 2 weeks, right? To do some, just working with the unit that was up there. And ultimately they let a warrant officer go because he's a warrant officer and I was a specialist. So they told me to go fuck myself and I did.
I mean, it was so seeing the Kurd Arab dynamic was really interesting too. Like, I mean, the Sunnis and the Shias, excuse me, they can have at it because I think no matter how many lines you draw in the sand, I guess the proverbial sand and literal sand, they're going to be probably at each other's throats. But the Kurds definitely, they're the underdogs who got motherfucked by pretty much everybody over the course of that war. But they were their best hope for an actual stable government in Iraq is the Kurds, because for one, they liked us, and then for twosies, like they had their shit together, man. Like they were so much more squared away than any of the Iraqi forces were, and they had that drive and that determination to see shit through instead of getting caught up in whatever cultural nuances and things that they inherited. Like they were removed enough from the things that caused so much of the chaos in Iraq with the civil war and everything, that they were a breath of fresh air. And they were professional too. Like their military was super professional. The Peshmerga was really squared up. Like they rolled in and they had situational awareness, and they looked like they knew what they were doing, and they moved right and everything like that. And the Iraqi guys were just like, they might as well have been Afghan army.
Yeah, so, especially because once you factor in that we pushed out all the actual Iraqi
army. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like had we, like I said, had we extended that olive branch to them and said, hey, let's help rebuild your country, even though we probably shouldn't have done this in the first place, I think things do end differently. But I do want to end this podcast on my favorite story about my time in the army, and that is when my company left a soldier in Baghdad.
Oh no! No!
So, I worked in the analysis and control element for 18th Airborne Corps, known as the ACE. It's the big intel cell, right? I work in a big windowless building, which on Fort Bragg literally used to be the old prison. Well, part of the structure or the setup is that we actually deploy like 2 months before the rest of the company, right? All the intel nerds in there, we take off, and then like the company leadership follows on 2 months later, right? Because that's just how it's set up. And so we had a soldier. She was in the skip with us, and then she got sent down to the company. So she's doing admin stuff for the company. And after about 6 weeks of them being in Baghdad, they actually finished out their deployment in Kuwait, right? Because they're ultimately just rear detachment support. They have nothing to do with the actual mission because we're intel, and they're just, the company leadership is really administrative at this point. And, the day comes where they're going to Kuwait. Okay. So the next day I'm in the DFAC on Camp Victory, which is still the best food I've ever had in the Army. And I see one of the soldiers who's in our company admin shop, and I go, why are you here? Well, what are you talking about? I said, the rest of the company is in fucking Kuwait. Like, what are you doing here? She goes, I thought that was tomorrow. I said, they fucking left without telling you?
Wow, that's pretty bad. I mean, when you said left in Baghdad, I was thinking like she was walking around the streets of Baghdad.
No,
so
damn.
I'm glad
no,
that
this
story
isn't
turned
the
out.
Hurt Locker. This is real life.
I thought she was just out on the streets somewhere. Like,
which is not that hard to do, to leave somebody out there like that.
Yeah.
But
no, they left her at Camp Victory, and like, what the fuck are you doing here? And so we saw our company commander and our company first sergeant like 5 months later, right? They were still the commander and the first sergeant. Like, let's see what happens when we get back from this deployment, right? And we get back from the deployment, and they were both gone in a month. Relief for cause, out of there, right? The one thing you can't do is leave a fucking soldier somewhere. Like, how do you manage to fuck that up? Because it's like when you look at the company, like the PAC office, it's what, a commander, a first sergeant, and then what, 4 or 5 Joes, realistically. How are you missing somebody?
Yeah.
And they absolutely fucking miss him. Yeah, did she
That's
miss
actually
roll call? Sure, but nobody tried to fucking find her.
Yeah, that's actually that's almost harder than losing somebody on a patrol to do that. You know,
right? Because they just left with that hey, where's so and so?
Yeah,
hanging
like
out
you
with
round the
us?
corner on in the streets of Iraq, and you get shot at, and you sprint a block, and next thing you know, just Private fucking Straka's back there. Because he's too scared to step on IED, so he's created a 300-meter gap in the formation. Not a real story. Happened in Afghanistan, but you get the point. But to actually forget somebody who's literally right there, right where you're shitting, eating, sleeping, and shaving, man, that's hard to believe.
And my favorite part of that whole story is when we got this new first sergeant, all the old heads in the company are oh, it's great, we got an infantry first sergeant, knock you intel when he's into shape. I'm like, yeah, how'd that fucking work out, dude? Left the goddamn soldier in a whole different fucking time zone.
Well, that's the cherry on the icing of the overall inefficiency that led to the miasmic shit show that Iraq was to become.
That is a great story to explain the war in Iraq.
It really is. Yeah, that says it all right there.
So.